Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the brand new Rebel Clash stuff, go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over the top 8 deck lists of the first Limitless Online Qualifier. The second one is happening this weekend, so I thought it was a good time. Now that myself and Jack's videos are pretty much wrapped up now for the first qualifier, we could review the most successful decks and also have a bit of a spiel on what I think the second qualifier is going to be like. The second qualifier is still Ultra Prism up to Sword and Shield, and then qualifiers 3 and 4 introduce Rebel Clash. So it's basically the last tournament that we have of this format. So it's a pretty developed metagame at this point, and we will be analysing these results. So this tournament was a 945 player event. It was free to enter, and obviously it was played over PTCGO, so potentially some minor differences to what you'd expect sort of the crowd would be compared to those physically going to tournaments. But still, large representation, and thanks to the sheer number of rounds that was played, even though it was best of one, Limitless kind of offset the RNG element by having a larger number of rounds. So these decks ultimately had very respectable records, and that's really what matters when we're looking at this stuff. So we'll start off with the winner. It was Oliver Montijo from Mexico, who was able to win with ATPsation. Now, I bet you're saying, yeah, ATPsation, what's new? Well, actually, there were some definite intriguing parts of this 60 compared to other lists that we've seen in the past. I don't think ATPsation has been playing Tapu Fini for a long time, actually, like up until this tournament, but it wasn't only Oliver's list that played the Tapu Fini. So Fini, a successful card in ADP. Going into this tournament, I think Baby Blacephalon was pretty hyped. So having a 1 prize, 1 energy answer is definitely helpful here. He's also playing a Frying Pan in his 60, so you can see there's a lot of respect here for the fire decks. Abilities Zard ended up doing quite well, but also things like Mewtwo teching in Victini, V, and also, again, Blacephalon, trying to make it harder for people to capitalize on this is a very nice deal. So some nice defensive tools here for defending against Blacephalon and such. I think you're also seeing that indicated by the high count of Marnie, actually choosing to play just 6 supporters total, 3 of them being Marnie and 3 of them being Research. It's a real big statement of how powerful he felt early game disruption would be in this format, where you can punish tag call based builds of ADP, where they can sometimes just whiff their second color of energy attachment if they can't tag call for Guzhala. Also punishing Baby Blacephalon lists, mostly, I think. Reset Stamp is not that useful against them, because usually they've thinned their deck already with all the Fiery Flints, so a bunch of their dead weight is gone, and also they have things like Oricorio and Jirachi already set up on the board. It's much, much more impactful to target Blacephalons in the early game with the Marnies, because they have way more jank in the first place, and also they can't benefit from the Oricorio because your opening turns are attaching to ADP rather than swinging with stuff. So the high Marnie count is something I can definitely foresee continuing in this list. Other than that, it's Spinner Bike, similar to what we've seen with Tord. He is playing 3 copies of Energy Switch. This is another, I think, potentially crucial component of why this list was so successful. Mill was a pretty popular archetype for this tournament, and having 3 copies of Energy Switch really does help out against Crushing Hammers, which are played a lot in Mill. Also, there's some other decks like Pikarom trying to add in things like Wait and See Hammer, just because they have Volkner in their 60. Energy Switch, thanks to Metal Saucer, is a great way around this. If you whiff turn 1 ADP attachment, or if it's removed by any means, you can still get that turn 2 GX value by going Saucer, Manual Attach the Water, and Energy Switch. So I think this is a nice way of you potentially playing greedier at times, where you can quick ball out Zacians and not worry about finding ADP turn 1. But also just a way of like bursting against these decks that are trying to control your hand attachment. So I really think the Energy Switch is likely going to be something that we see in future lists. Now, 3 count may be a little bit too high for my taste. I'd immediately want to put in a 4th Research just to stop my heart palpitations. But a couple Energy Switch I think is a really solid plan for ADP going forward, because basically the only way people have come up with answers to this deck so far is trying Crushing Hammer or Yell Grunt, and this really does put a stop to that, which is excellent. Other than that, we're seeing custom catchers, 1 Great Catcher and 1 Oranguru for resource management, as, again, more mill answers in the list, rather than having things like coin flip Pokemon catchers. There's been some contention. In this tournament, I played coin flip catchers, for example, as did Jack, as our like answer to control. This list has maybe... Well, the mirror is interesting because you have energy switches, so like if you go second, you can still be the one to GX first, so that's kind of mirror helpful. But you have a little bit less gust sometimes than other 60s, so that's a small thing that I'd be a little bit concerned about going into Qualifier 2, where Pokemon catchers again seem very strong because mill is big, but also just flipping aheads on a Pokemon catcher is so big in mirror. If your Zacian kills their Zacian, etc., that they've had like 1 or 2 energy attachments on, just via like Intrepid Swording and playing your sources like pre-Marnie or pre-research. So I think potentially Coin Flip Catcher could be a good option for this tournament over Monkey, but also there's so much expected mill with the good performances that it had. Keeping Oranguru in the list is obviously a very good deal. I played Oranguru back in Sweden for my top 16 finish. I did find it useful in every mill matchup, for sure. It also gives you that bailout option against Obstagoon. Now, I think Obstagoon is probably a way like worse position deck going into this tournament because mill was so successful and Obstagoon scoops mill. But having that profound knowledge as a fallback option is definitely good for you. And I think another reason why Obstagoon is really, really bad for this tournament is because this monkey has ended up in the first place list. I think a lot of people will be adopting a list similar to this, maybe making 1 or 2 changes only. And that's just going to be a headache for Obstagoon in general. One other interesting note is that the only damage modifier in this list is Double Shrine. So I feel like this list can be capitalized on by tag team decks if they want to play Celtic Swell, for example. So I think maybe even working in 1 Vitality Band could be interesting. So I don't think there's much flexibility in this list. I think eating into things like the energy switch counts, maybe eating into the Acrobite count a little bit, maybe thinking if the Feeny is still worth it going into the next qualifier. Those are the sort of spaces that we're looking at here to make the adjustments that we want, working in potentially a Vitality Band, or just taking out Monkey, Great Catcher, and going towards coin flips. That's really where I'm at with the list. But I think overall, really, really solid baseline, and you can see why it was so successful based on the metagame that we actually saw in this tournament. Dominic Maliki was able to come second. He also streamed like the entire time, which is pretty awesome. And he was playing Cincino Control. Again, not too surprising to see this at the top tables. It's been a tier 1 archetype throughout this format, pre this tournament. A few interesting additions in this 60. It's playing double Yell Grunts alongside the Crushing Hammers to try and prevent the ADP from setting up in the first place, or at least buy yourself time to start getting rid of their resources here and there. It's playing double Stealthy Hood to help out against Ninetales based builds, which is also quite interesting alongside that Wob effect. So if you can Stealthy Hood Wob, then he's protected and Victini can't be their big reload. So it does have some fire matchup answers, which I think is nice. Other than that, pretty straightforward, to be honest. It's a very simplistic list. It is playing the Magcargo combo rather than anything else. Now, I've seen a bunch of different variations, a bunch of different opinions on mill going into this tournament. Obviously, the Cincino wasn't the only mill list that did well this tournament, and this one seems weaker in the mirror against the Magcargo variant. So just straight out of the gate, Cincino may be challenged by other mill players, but also the fact that Energy Switch was the first place list does bring into question things like Yell Grunt, Crushing Hammer. There is potential for us to move towards Latios Psychic Energies going into the second qualifier, so just something to bear in mind. I know Grant Manley's most recent Dolls list played double Latios and a bunch of Psychic Energies, just to try and establish that on the opening turns and just say that's going to be how you beat ADP. It does put a lot of pressure on a list like this, and it might need to work in more copies of Calm or Acrobike for early game draw, just to try and get a Latios off. But if you are removing Crushing Hammers and Yell Grunts, the spaces naturally free themselves up. So I think that's a potential development of mill going forward. I think in terms of matchups, you are worried about E-Switch list if you are playing this 60, and you are worried about Magcargo, which is the other mill list that we'll get into now, because I believe it made top form. Yeah. Oh no, it didn't make top 4. We just had 2 more ADP variants. So Ross Korfin brought an awesome variant of ADP here. This is pretty much a Ross Korfin creation. He is bringing Spiritomb ADP, and I've tested a good amount of this deck at this point. I think it was a very creative decision, and I don't necessarily love every single decision in his list, but I love the core concept of ADP and Spiritomb as a combo. You naturally spend your opening couple of turns building Smite and doing nothing, but rather than doing nothing, you're committing your energies towards Altar Creation, so you can cheat prices in the mid game, which is just insane. So Spiritomb with that Altar Creation GX attack buff, with things like Big Charm and Hustle Belt, you do reach very dangerous damage output, very similar to Zacian in many ways, when you build enough Spite onto your Spiritombs. Especially with things like Jinx helping you out, removing early Rainbow or Shrine damage that you put on your own ADPs or Dedenes, you can have that Spiritomb push even more. So Spiritomb actually becomes a real big damage output threat, but most importantly, it's a 1 prize damage output threat. It really helps your matchup against Baby Blounds, which I think is big. Mirror, I think you're a little bit favored with this 60, to be honest. And also, it randomly gives you a nice out against Magcargo, which obviously wasn't something Ross had in mind going into this tournament, but building Spite to stealth knockout to get around the Mareep Sleep combo is actually a legitimate thing that could help you out going into Qualifier 2. So I believe Spiritomb to be a pretty well-poised deck going into the next Qualifier, maybe adding in an Oranguru to make yourself a little bit safer, or also adding in different means of gusting. Adding some customs alongside some of these Pokemon catchers could be an alternate option. The Fione is definitely helpful, again, against control, but also against things like Mali, because spell tags seem much more impactful in this list than it does in the Zacian build. That being said, most Malamars, as a bus drives past me, most Malamars are playing like double Mimikyu now in this format, so they're trying to just one-bop Zacian anyways, so it's basically the same as a Spiritomb, really. But having Fione and a bunch of Gust gives you an option to gust around spell tags for as long as possible, really, so that's interesting. For me, wiggle room wise, I think like the third Jinx has always felt fluffy to me. That feels like a free space in a lot of situations. Maybe working in a Guzhala just to complement your tag call package. That was like one of the first things I did. Maybe working in another skateboard could be a reasonable option. Working in more Marnies and stuff. These are really the things I had in mind. Initially, I went to double Dedenne as one of the first changes that I made. I actually quite quickly changed back to just the 1 copy to be a late game push card, because just in how the prize waste works out against most decks, they knock out an ADP, you want them to have to go through 3 other things. It just gives you more time than putting down that Dedenne. So the intuition of me wanting to put a second Dedenne into this list actually didn't work out how I thought after testing it. So the 1 count just as like that late game push dig for game option is why it's a 1 count, rather than having 2 in here to just be like, okay, I'm missing pieces, Dedenne change turn 1, because it really hurts you later on in the game in how your opponent finds their own win condition. So yeah, I think instinctively there's a few things that jump out as strange counts, but they actually do make sense as you start playtesting this deck. So I think it's a really solid list, like I said, and it feels relatively well poised. Like I said, there may be some new punishing things coming out, like the Baby Blacephalon in Mewtwo players lists has been an option before just because of Stinger combos, but it could be an option once again with this 60, and a few other things here and there can certainly punish a heavy building Spite approach. But at the same time, against Mill and then against Mirror, so other ADPs, it seems solid, and it seems safer against Blounds as well. So, like, what more do you really want in a deck? It seems well poised and a very, very smart deck decision from Ross. He's obviously one of the most decorated players of all time, and known for his own wacky creations and looking at the meta differently. And yeah, it just paid off once again. So we see the other ADPsation variants here from Ithiel, and he is also playing that Tapu Fini in his list. For damage modifiers, he's playing Vitality Band Zigzagoon and playing no copies of Shrine whatsoever. Vital Band Goon does give you the option to 1-bop an ADP, which is nice, and also it's like 2 different ways of putting 1 extra counter on other tag teams, so that's pretty cool. Swell, I do enjoy in this format for making life difficult for Welder-based variants. They can't get their Hearth developed. Also, obviously helps out against Pikaron for slowing down their options turn 1. This actually reminds me a lot of Medihafi's list from Sweden, where it's got the 2 Guzhalas and a bunch of individual tools. Just for versatility, really. There's obviously times when Frying Pan's great. There's times when Ballooningization is like the right move. There's times when you want that big charm on ADP. You just have a lot of flexibility with this sort of 60. So I like this approach. I've seen it work with Medi. I've played against Medi's list, and it's like hard to play around. And also what reminds me of Medi's list is that it's playing the 4 custom for Pokemon Catcher. A bunch of Gust, again, can be really good in Mirror. It's a natural way of helping out against Mill as well. So this is another pick up and play list that I think is just fine out the gate. The things that I'd try and work in, possibly a 3rd Jirachi, possibly a 2nd Marnie. That's basically like all I would want in this list in terms of differences. Other than that, we're looking pretty solid. A 10 count of energy is kind of offset by the fact that you are playing a thicker Guzhala package. It makes you lean into that a little bit more, which can sometimes be awkward if you miss early Intrepid Swords. But you can see the 4 count of Zacian kind of makes up for it a lot of the time, because that'll be like your starter more often than any other Pokemon. So yeah, very interesting 60. I like the versatility and tools. Many people will like try and trim away from some of the lesser seen ones, but giving you these options just gives you a lot of freedom in the mid game, because you've had like more optimal turns on like turn 1 and 2 basically, which is interesting. Zach Cooper and Sam Epstein, they were both in top 8, sorry, with the Magcargo lists. And this is definitely an alternate way of playing Belelba Mill. And it's one that we hadn't really seen be credited too much. It was kind of piloted in OCIC, but then was kind of dropped after the success of Cincino. But this one's come back with a vengeance. Like I said, I feel like it's mirror favored because you have Fluffy Pillow denying their resource management on certain turns. Also, because you're smooth overing the key cards rather than physically self-milling, you're naturally a little bit favored. Now, does that mean you're gonna be able to win in 20 minutes? I'm not sure. But I imagine you probably will. So yeah, it depends how much fluffy pillowing you can do against stuff. But ultimately, I think that seems pretty reasonable in your favor. And having the fluffy pillow trap is an extra way just to buy yourself free turns when otherwise you might not. And as we've seen, a turn here or there is the difference between getting rid of your opponent's 3rd custom catcher and not. And when you get their 3rd custom catcher and stuff like that, you just straight up win the game. So yeah, definitely an interesting alternate approach. I think going into this tournament, you have to be worried about a few people potentially teching in like Malolana as an extra supporter option to retreat out of things like Sleep Trap. Also, more people just playing Higher Gust and Monkey, like we've seen in ATPsation. But just as an alternate to Mill, I can't really comment on many changes to this list because I haven't played it myself. So I can't really instinctively point out like certain counts of cards that look strange, but ultimately it just looks pretty normal from here. For both Cincino and Magcargo lists, you might want to bear in mind an answer to Stinger, because that could easily, like, one thing I could see from the next qualifier is more people are going to be playing Mewtwo Big Charm Swell for the next qualifier, because you can have Stinger Blown, and Big Charm Swell is like good against all of the ADPs we've seen in the recent 60s, so something to bear in mind. I believe Sam played a very similar list. Yeah, it was literally the same list. And also you could see it got a top 16 and a top 32 placement as well. So a bunch of people played the same 60, so clearly quite an optimized list. Kevin came in with a top 8 with Ability Zard. I know he's a friend of the channel, so hello, I guess. I didn't really know what to say there, but yeah. Here we go. We get to see Ability Zard. Again, one of these archetypes that has breakout performances here and there, but is not really picked up too much. The best thing about Ability Zard at the moment is that you don't need to make any inherent changes to your 60 to make it just like good in the meta. You notice that he's playing double Flint in addition to the Stadiums and Marshadow, so you can see he's very conscious of Swell right now in the meta, which is something that's really the biggest standout card, I guess you could say. Like the Marshadow as a deck choice in addition to the Flints is the biggest standout choice, and I think Pokegears over things like Acrobikes is the other choice, because Welder is how you win the game at the end of the day with this deck, so just leaning into that as much as possible is a pretty reasonable decision overall. Not seeing any cherishes in this 60, just going for the 4 quick, 3 calm. Again, some interesting choices here, but ultimately nothing too unreasonable at all. Fire Crystal in addition to the flints as well, just trying to make yourself gust as much as you can, even if you don't have Infinity available to you. Overall, it's a pretty straightforward, streamlined ability Zard. And yeah, seems pretty, again, solid going into the next tournament because it doesn't have to make any outright changes to the list to be just like reasonable. You have to get the good sign of variance at times, but what deck doesn't really in this format? And finally, we have Wyatt with another Cincino variant. This one is playing the Aerodactyl Fighting Energy combo to try and help out against Stinger. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, trying to beat Stinger might be a bigger priority in the second qualifier. Again, just because of the popularity of Mill. Otherwise, it has only the Crushing Hammers and Faber as options to help out against early game ADP manual attachments. So a bit of a fear there, I guess, going into the next qualifier. But you can only dedicate slots to so many things. It does have Magneton to potentially be favored in Mirror. You are forcing yourself behind in a prize race so you can surge. But you've also got Girafarig as well, so Mirror teched in many ways. Girafarig helps out in a handful of other situations like Mewtwo matchup and stuff. So good stuff to bear in mind. Other than that, pretty, again, straightforward Cincino Mill. It's got an interesting split of Evo, Incense, and Calm, kind of min-maxing in a couple of ways, but ultimately another solid core of Cincino. If you want to see a more broad overview of the top 170 decks that made Day 2, you can go ahead and check out the Facebook page that we have, Complexity Card Gaming. We've got a nice pie chart. I couldn't be bothered to get it up. But essentially, ADP and Mill were like a couple of the big winners. Baby Blacephalon did notably worse than I think a lot of people expected. It was pretty hyped going into this tournament. The highest placement was Shintaro Ito, and he was... Oh, sorry, no, I'm wrong. He was playing Magcargo Mill. It was Joshua Gallies playing Baby Blounds, so... Yeah, the highest placement was, what, top 32, something like that, so... pretty interesting going forward. I don't know if it has the best Mill matchup. Also, things like Pikarom didn't do too hot again, just a top 32 placement. Gramble did make a cool top 16 from Jens, a Norwegian player who does test with Tord, so he's from good stock, I guess you could say. He went on a 7-0 spree in Day 2, which is pretty interesting. So if you want to try out some Gramble and have fun, go ahead. But yeah, just bear in mind, he has probably played that deck like near perfectly, to be honest. Outside of that, yeah, there's not too many other stories here. I think the highest placing Mewtwo wasn't the Welder build, it was actually Magcargo that made... Malamar that made a top 16. Also, Nico Alabas was playing it to a top 32, so... yeah, 3 Mewtwo Mallies in top 32 and no other Mallies... no other Mewtwo's. Until we get down to Ilya, who was playing it with Soul Burst by the looks of things, so... It's interesting to see Ability Zard performing and really outperforming Welder Mewtwo, to be honest. I think for my knee-jerk reactions from these tournament results, obviously you have to be aware of Mill, and obviously you have to be aware of ATPsation. I think Mewtwo covers those quite nicely by having Big Charm Swell available to you, and also having Stinger available. So my knee-jerk reaction is there's going to be a small uptick in Mewtwo. Malamar, regular Mally, again, kind of didn't do too well. I think there was 9 Malamar lists, maybe even less, straight Mallies, and they were all towards the lower end of the spectrum here in Day 2. It might have even been less than 9, to be honest. Can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, essentially I'd expect a small uptick in Mewtwo, and just in general, an uptick in tag teams that add in Swell Big Charm as a combo to try and answer Zacian ADP. And obviously Mill techs. People are going to be more aware, adding in more switch outs, more gust outs, their own Orangaroos for sure, going into the next qualifier. I think there'll be a handful of people moving away from the Zacian build of ADP towards the Spiritomb build of ADP. Also, the Spiritomb list is obviously way cheaper to access online than getting 4 Zacians, so potentially that's also a reason that will draw people into that sort of 60. Other than that, I don't see too many things changing. yeah, I think it's overall a decent representation of this meta. Only one more qualifier to go, and then we can start going into Rebel Clash stuff. I'll be kicking off Rebel Clash videos once again from tomorrow as well. So I know you guys have been asking me for it forever, and I'm really behind schedule, but I'm going to get back to daily content. Don't worry about it, guys. I've been putting in the work behind the scenes for sure. So yeah, hope you did enjoy this ramble, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.